Very much, Brad, for the introduction. And I guess the organizing committee for this series of lectures, one of the things they wanted done was just some discussion about understanding and interpreting soil test reports. So that's what I'll be talking about for the next 45 minutes. And I really look at soil testing and soil test reports as being very, very important for really all farmers in Western Canada. If you look in Alberta, the average year, Alberta farmers spend more than $1 billion on fertilizer, and individual farmers, it's very commonly will spend $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 annually on fertilizer. So you really want to make sure that you're getting the best information and advice as possible, and to make wise fertilizer decisions. And soil test reports go a long way to help with that. So when I look at as an introduction, by way of introduction on soil test reports really do a very nice job to just provide this soil analysis of actual values of various physical and chemical factors or determinations. Most labs are quite good about giving a rating system for each of the factors or determinants, and particularly for farmers that are wanting to evaluate soil nutrient levels, that really gives a very good basis for developing fertilizer recommendations. And finally, one thing I always like to point out, at most labs on the soil test report will actually provide fertilizer recommendations for you, but those are general recommendations, and really to fine tune and develop your own fertilizer recommendations, that's really your job working with your fertilizer dealer or your agronomist. But before you talk about interpretation, it really falls into a sequence. We have to make sure we do the soil sampling properly, the soil analysis properly, and then we can interpret and understand the soil tests quite nicely. Really, when we come to soil sampling, more and more we're hearing a lot about developing soil management zones on a quarter section or a half section of land. When we have variable landscapes, that's something to really strongly consider, is having different soil management zones for different soils in the same field. I always encourage farmers to soil sample down to 24 inches. I prefer 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24 inches. Many agronomists will just do a 0 to 6 inch depth, and then they'll do a 6 to 24 inch depth. But I prefer breaking it down to 3 depths. But even if you do that, those 2 depths down to 24 inches, that's still very good. And then in terms of sampling, you can randomly sample. For example, on a very uniform quarter section, you can randomly take all your soil samples. But if you're on a situation where you have more variable topography in soils, you might want to go to benchmark sampling, where you take soil samples in very specific zones. And in each soil management zone or field, you should be taking at least 20 to 25 samples. And people wonder, well, why take so many samples? Well, on a quarter section, 160 acres, if you have 6 inches deep for 160 acres, there's 320 million pounds of soil approximately. And you're going to take a 2-pound sample that's got to be representative of that 320 million pounds. You want to make sure you take at least 20 to 25 samples per field or per management zone to make sure you have a good representation of that field. And then when you take your samples, well, usually late fall is just fine. Early spring is sometimes better, but doesn't give you a lot of time to do your fertilizer planning. But in years like this, in southern Alberta, where we have a very mild winter, there can be changes from fall till spring. Normally fall sampling is fine, but in warm years, you might want to do a bit of double checking over winter. Check your samples again in the spring, or check some of your fields in the spring to make sure there haven't been any changes. And when you send your soil sample to a lab, you want to make sure that they're really using the right soil test methods for the province that you're in. And then finally, you can do the interpretation and making sure you understand what the soil tests are actually telling you. I do just want to make a couple of comments about soil variability and topography. Topography is a very dominant soil forming factor. And so just in this chart, it shows is when you have precipitation falling, you have less precipitation actually get into the soil on upper slope positions, more at lower slope positions. And over 10,000 years of soil formation and development, you really wind up having different soils in the upper versus mid slope versus lower slope positions. So when you have situations or fields like this with variable topography, you really want to look at doing different management zones, sampling them separately, and then managing them differently from a fertilizer application standpoint. And this is just a picture of the south of Lethbridge. Not very much change in topography, but the hilltops are definitely different than the lower slope position. So just something to think about. And here I've just got 3 different soil cores just to kind of drive that point home. This is just from a normal part of the field. We have a very nice A horizon, B horizon, and a very clean C horizon. So if we're sampling 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24, that's going to give us some very nice information. But if you just move over about 50 yards, there was this core in the field, just a little bit different topography, slope position, a little lighter color in the A horizon, a little less organic matter, a little bit different soil profile. So we're going to have a different levels of nutrients in this profile versus the first profile. And finally, if we look at a hilltop, and there's not a lot of variation in terms of upper and lower slope position in this particular field, you can see a very light colored A horizon, and at about 8 inches we're into C horizon material, lots of carbonates and gypsum salts, and much different profile here versus here. And so we really want to think about how variable are your soils across landscape and be sampling them separately if need be. But I just wanted to drive that point home in terms of soil variability before we start talking about soil testing and soil test report interpretation. So this is just a generalized soil test report we put together a number of years ago just to kind of explain soil test reports. The first information up in here just really is grower information, the address of the farm, the field name, legal land location, and the samples were taken. Just make sure that information is correct. And then we have nutrient information, soil quality information, other types of soil quality information over here. And in terms of nutrients, we've been looking at it in terms of parts per million and pounds per acre. Then finally, at the bottom of the report, there's fertilizer recommendations. So there's a lot of information packed in this soil test report. So let's kind of break it down and start off with the nutrient analysis. And in this particular case, some labs will report all the nutrients in parts per million, and in some of them, it will convert to pounds per acre. We'll talk about how to do that. But really, then all the nutrients we would need to potentially want to look at would include nitrogen. We tend to take, when we're doing a nitrogen determination, we're determining nitrate nitrogen, then phosphate, then potassium, which is K, then sulfate. And then we'll look at calcium and magnesium. It's very rare that we ever see calcium and magnesium being deficient across Western Canada in our young soils, but it's something that labs do determine. And then finally, we'll look at micronutrients, B for boron, Cl for chloride, Cu for copper, Fe for iron, Mn for manganese, and zinc. And for the most part, micronutrient deficiencies are the exception rather than the rule, but there's certainly places and certain soil types that do tend to be micronutrient deficient. So there are times you do want to be testing for those, and we'll talk about that a little later. But these are all different micronutrients you can test for. The ones I'm most concerned about are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. And so as I mentioned, some labs will report these values in parts per million. As a matter of fact, they'll all be reported, the micronutrients are always reported in parts per million. The major nutrients, N, P, K, and S, sometimes I'll be reporting in ppm, but then they'll convert them over to pounds per acre. And how do we actually make that conversion? Well, here ppm stands for parts per million, and over here we have the abbreviated form of pounds per acre. But how do you convert that? If we have, say, for example, 11 parts per million of phosphorus in a 0 to 6 inch depth, well, 1 acre of land, 6 inches deep, weighs about 2 million pounds. So if we multiply parts per million by 2 in a 0 to 6 inch depth, then that's going to give us pounds per acre. So here we are, 11 parts per million multiplied by 2 comes to 22 pounds per acre. Now, if you have a 0 to 12, sorry, a 12 inch depth sample, for example, here, you have a 12 inch depth sample, well, then that 12 inch depth of soil will weigh about 4 million pounds. So we're going to multiply that value. For example, here we have 8 parts per million of sulfate. We multiply that by 4, that comes to 32. So that's what we do to convert to a 12 inch depth sample from parts per million to pounds per acre. Then finally, as I mentioned, some labs or some soil sample people will take a 0 to 12 inch depth sample, which is fine. But if you take a 6 to 24 inch depth sample, then you have an 18 inch depth. Multiply that by 6 to convert to pounds per acre. If you have a bit of variation, then you multiply in terms of parts per million, and you multiply by 6, and you could wind up with a bit of an error. So the deeper your sample, the more potential there might be for a bit of error. So I prefer to do 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24 inch depths personally. But that's how you convert from parts per million to pounds per acre. And typically we'll do that for N, P, K, and S. But for all the micronutrients, we always deal with those in terms of parts per million. So next thing we'd like to look at are soil quality factors. And in this particular case, we'll start off with the pH. pH really is just an abbreviation for the term power of hydrogen. So really what we're doing is measuring the amount of hydrogen ions in the soil. The more hydrogen you have in the soil, the more acidic it is, the less you have, the more alkaline or basic it is. And the pH of 7.0 is exactly neutral. When we're doing a soil test for pH, if you're in a range of 6.5 to 7.5, I consider that to be very near neutral, and soil pH will vary by half a unit over the growing season. So 6.5 to 7.5 is near neutral. As long as your pH is in a range of 6 to 8, that's just fine. Some people say, well, if your pH is 7.5 to 8, that's not good. I don't worry about that at all. That's just fine. Matter of fact, I'd rather have a pH of 7.5 than 5.5. And once your pH starts dropping below 6, then it becomes acidic, and then you do have to have you need to be concerned once you're down in that 5.5 range, or if your pHs are up at 8.4. Again, you would be concerned. You want to be talking about a soil specialist, but what are the problems you need to be dealing with there? As long as you're in this normal range, then everything is fine. Another thing we like to look at is EC. That's what really stands for electrical conductivity, which is a measure of soluble salts. And the more salts you have in the soil, the less, the greater the concern it is. The more salts you have, the poorer the crops are going to really perform. Now, as long as your soil test shows you're less than 1, and the unit is used here is DS/AMS, that stands for decisiemens per meter. As long as you're less than 1, that's perfect for topsoil, but mean 0 to 6 inch depth. If you're between 1 and 2, I get a little bit concerned, but I'm not going to get too concerned. But I certainly that catches my attention. But once you're between 2 and 4 decisiemens per meter, then you can start looking at yield reductions of 10 to 40%, depending on how sensitive the crop is. Once you get up to 6 to 8, then it really becomes a huge issue. A lot of crops really will yield very poorly when you're in EC of 8. And it's down here, I have a little picture of a saline field. You can see the white salts. When you see white salts in the field, then you know your decisiemens per meter are probably going to be up in that. Definitely more than 10, probably in the range of 15 or 20. So when you have slight salinity like this, we call it hidden salinity, it's going to reduce yield. You're certainly not going to see any evidence of salts on the soil surface. Some other things it's nice to look at. OM stands for organic matter. That gives it to you in percent. It's not an exact determination. It's nice to know if you're 2 or 4 or 6% organic matter in your soil. And then finally, soil texture. Labs can determine that for you. It's just a measure of the amount of sand, silt, and clays to determine if you're a sandy loam or a loam or a clay loam, so in terms of soil texture. Now, other things that labs will determine might involve cation exchange capacity. And that's just really the ability of the soil to hold cations. And cations are just positively charged elements. Examples would be calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. Those are the 4 of the cations that cause soils to have a higher pH. Some of the ones that would cause soils to have a lower pH would be hydrogen and aluminum. And so those are some of the other things that we'll look at as well. Because the cation exchange capacity is just the ability to hold cations. Typically, it's determined in milliequivalents per 100 grams of soil. The higher the number, the more cations it'll hold. Typically, the higher your cation exchange capacity, the more clay you have in your soil. Really, it's just a factor of how much clay you have in your soil. And this factor, this determination does not change from year to year. If you're checking cation exchange capacity of your soil every year, year after year in the same spot, it's going to be the same year after year. So it's really a waste of money to determine it every year. Now, another thing that some labs will determine is percent base saturation. The bases are the calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. And if your pH is above 7, well, then your base saturation will be 100%. If you're less than 7, then you'll start to see the base saturation drop from 100% to lower. That'll affect the percentage of calcium, magnesium, and potassium and sodium on the exchange complex. So really, it's just really what you're doing, just measuring the percentage of calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium on the exchange complex. And again, this does not change from year to year unless you're putting on lime or gypsum or elemental sulfur in very large amounts. So normally this will not change from year to year. So it's something you don't really need to be testing for every year. It's almost really a waste of money. Determine it once, but it's not going to change from year to year. And some labs will actually give you ratios, for example, the ratio of potassium to magnesium. For Western Canada, I say ignore those values. They are absolutely meaningless. Some agronomists will use them to make recommendations. And in my opinion, that's a very, very flawed way of making recommendations to farmers. And I'm always very concerned when I hear agronomists doing that for farmers in Western Canada. Something that I definitely would not recommend. So as a bottom line, really, it's not necessary to test for cation exchange capacity or base saturation every year. It's not something that's going to change as long as you're going back to the same location in your field. And finally, it comes to fertilizer recommendations. And I always suggest to farmers review those, but these are general recommendations that the lab is going to give you. And really, it's up to you to start doing fine tuning. You have unique fields. Some fields are going to be better yielding, or maybe not as good yielding. You know how your fields perform. You know what your yield goals are. There are various field conditions. If you have good moisture going into spring or poor moisture. So from there, with these basic recommendations the lab is giving you, what you want to do is go through and then fine tune for your fields and the crops you're planning to grow. So that's really where you have a good discussion with your agronomist, your fertilizer dealer, to really get them fine tuned to meet your requirements. So now what I'd like to do is just show you a few different soil test reports. This was a couple of reports that a friend of mine at farm just north and east of Lethbridge. We went through these just a week or two ago. This particular analysis is from a lab in Lethbridge called Down to Earth Labs, a very good lab. In this particular case, they reported nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, all in pounds per acre. They don't actually report them here in pounds, in parts per million, that's pounds per acre. Then you even have a bar graph here to give you an estimate of what their irradiance are. So nitrogen is low, phosphorus is only 7 pounds per acre, so it's very deficient. Potassium is optimum at just under 500 pounds per acre. Sulfur is very low. Calcium, magnesium, I mentioned, are very rare that we ever run into a problem with these. Then you can look at some of the quality factors. It's an irrigated field, so with irrigation water having a pH of 8.5, most of our irrigated cells typically have pHs in a range of 7.5 to 8, so that's quite normal. Salt levels here are 0.5 decisiemens per meter. Again, very good. Now, in this particular case, they did do analysis for base saturation. This is very typical for soils in southern Alberta, about 80% calcium, just under 20% magnesium, 2.5% potassium. Now, some people will start recommending potassium when your levels are less than 4%. That's a very foolish way to be making a recommendation for potassium. You want to look at the available and exchangeable on cell test here, not a base saturation. But the only time I really get worried when I'm looking at base saturation, let's see, sodium up at 4%, I start to get worried, and if it's at 10%, then I'm very worried because then I know your soil is developing a sodic problem. But so there's times I look at this, but for most of the time, I don't use this at all to make fertilizer recommendations. And again, as I mentioned, it's not something you normally need to really look at. Now look at these numbers here for potassium 7 and potassium just under 500. Look at his next soil test report. You'll see here we're looking at 690 pounds of phosphorus and almost 3,000 pounds for potassium. As soon as I see that, I know instantly this field has had a lot of manure, probably repeated applications of manure. But then here the soil test is telling us, well, we're just between low and optimum for nitrogen. We have excessive levels of phosphorus, potassium, almost excessive levels of sulfur. They did do the micronutrients here, and they're all actually in the optimum range except for boron. The boron cell test is not really that accurate. And probably about a third of our soils in southern Alberta will test low in boron, but they won't respond to boron. So I don't really get that concerned when I see a lower value for boron. Then looking at pH, 7.4 for the pH. Organic matter is 4.2, and I should have mentioned on the last slide, but most labs will, based on organic matter, will give you an estimated nitrogen base as well, which is useful at times. So they're just in a different field, farmed by the same farmer, with very different cell test results. And as a result, you're going to develop very different fertilizer recommendations for one field versus another. Now, this particular soil test came from north of Edmonton that I got in the fall. It's the analysis done by Element Labs. Formerly it was Exova, the name was changed about 1.5 years ago. And previously it was Bodycoat Labs. Before that it was actually Northwest Labs. So it's gone through a few name changes over the last number of years. In this particular case, all the nutrients up here are all reported in parts per million. And in the lab, for N, P, K, and S has converted those from 0 to 6 and 6 to 12 inch depth. They've converted that to pounds per acre. I should mention that all of our soil test values that we're really concerned about for phosphorus and potassium, really we're just looking at the 0 to 6 inch depth, but for nitrogen and sulfur, we're looking at the 0 to 6 inch, 6 to 12 inch, and preferably even 12 to 24 inch, but that wasn't done in this particular case. And for micronutrients, typically we're just looking at the 0 to 6 inch depth, but I do like to look at it at the 6 to 12 inch depth to see if it's deficient in the 6 to 12 inch depth and the 0 to 6 inch depth. And then this lab also gives a bar graph giving you a rating. So they rated N, and the P is very low, potassium is optimum, sulfur is marginal as usual, calcium, magnesium is excellent. Then most of the nutrients are kind of just right at the marginal to optimum range, with the exception of copper. And this is not uncommon to see copper deficiency on the gray and gray-black transition and black soils up in central and north central Alberta. Whenever I see copper less than 0.5 parts per million, I'm concerned, and typically I'd be recommending copper. Then when we have over here pH 7.3, that's just fine. EC at less than 1, that's just fine. Organic matter, very nice to have organic matter levels up in the 8 to 10 range, and that would certainly indicate it would be a black soil. And then they've also done base saturation, it's 100. And then looking at calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium, they give them percentage. Like I say, it's interesting, maybe test for it once, but as long as everything is fine, you don't need to do it again year after year, but you really don't need that to make your fertilizer recommendations. And I'll just show you one last report. This is from an Eastern Canada lab. In this particular case, there's 4 different fields. They've just been sampled at 0 to 6 inch depth. And I like to stress it's very important. We need to be testing down to 24 inches, particularly for nitrogen and sulfur. And for the other labs we looked at, they actually, for Alberta, our recommended method for phosphorus testing is the modified Kelowna method. That's not used in Eastern Canada. They use bicarb method, sodium bicarbonate method, and the Bray method. And we've never calibrated the Bray method for Alberta soils. We have for a sodium bicarbonate method, but it doesn't perform as well in Alberta as a modified Kelowna. So that's why we recommend modified Kelowna. And then in this particular case, you've used L for low, or M for moderate, or H for high. So they're giving you indications for what the levels are. But I tend to, with this particular lab, for Alberta standards, I sometimes disagree with the readings. For example, medium levels for calcium, low levels are actually very high. These levels for magnesium, they're well above what I would consider to be the critical level. I wouldn't call them low. So I would have different ratings than what this particular lab is. So you always want to look at the lab and see how they're interpreting them, and then compare how would we do interpret those for Alberta conditions. But in this particular case, the lab has recommended lime, very high rates of nitrogen, modest rates of phosphorus. They recommended potassium, they recommended magnesium, which I would never recommend. In this case, they recommended sulfur. They've also recommended copper and boron. Now, I would actually agree with the copper recommendation, because copper in all cases is less than 0.5, so I would agree with the copper recommendation. Some of the other ones I wouldn't. But really, it comes down to you to look at the soil test report and interpret it wisely with your agronomist or your fertilizer dealer. I just made a comment here. Really, in my mind, when I talk about calcium, as long as your levels are 300 parts per million or higher, you don't need to worry about calcium in Western Canada. And for magnesium, 35 parts per million or higher, you don't need to worry about magnesium. And so be very, very cautious. And in this particular case, they are recommending magnesium based on looking at this and then looking at KM ratio, but I just don't agree with it. So that's basically a very quick way that I've been doing in terms of interpreting the soil test reports, to get a bit of a sense. Now, let's actually look at N, P, K, and S and look at how I would actually develop recommendations. So we'll start off with nitrogen. That is often the most important fertilizer we're using for cereal and oilseed crops. And one of the ways I like to look and develop fertilizer recommendation is look at fertilizer response curves that have been done previously. This is a generic one that I put together. So if we were to not put any fertilizer on, this curve is saying, well, we get about 30 bushels. Put on 10 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer, we're going to bump our yield up to 40. Put another 10 pounds on, we're going to get another 8 bushels. Put another 10 pounds, we're going to keep on increasing our yield. So each 10-pound increment of fertilizer, we're increasing our yield. We're going to reach a point where the slope of the curve is going to get flatter and flatter until finally the curve is flat. So our optimum yield is occurring at this point. But really, I would call that the maximum yield, or optimum yield from an economic standpoint is probably in this range here. So I'd say better to put on 100 pounds than 130 pounds to shoot for the maximum yield. But how do we actually go about doing that? Well, we need some information. Basically, we want to have this crop yield curve, and we want to base our fertilizer recommendation on that yield increase curve, looking at the cost of nitrogen fertilizer and the value of the crop. So what information do we need? We need to have, first of all, have a nitrogen fertilizer response curve that's going to be fairly accurate for the soil area that you're in. You need soil test nitrogen information. For dryland farmers, it's nice to know your soil moisture, because we actually have developed curves for 2 and 4 and 6 inches of stored soil moisture. And then you want to know the cost of your nitrogen fertilizer and your predicted crop value. So I'm just going to use an example from some curves that we developed. This is a fact sheet we put together after we did developed a fertilizer response curves for a number of different cereal and oilseed crops that are contained in this particular publication. It's actually on the Alberta Agriculture website. This is actually the curve or the response chart for hybrid spring wheat. So let's say our self-test value is 40 pounds of nitrogen in a 0 to 24 inch combined depth. Put on no fertilizer, we're going to get about 48 bushels per acre. As we increase our nitrogen fertilizer application at 10-pound increments, we can see our yield is getting higher and higher, but eventually it's going to flatten out at some point. So really all I've done here is we put on no fertilizer, that's our approximate yield increase. But really what I'd like to look at is what is the yield increase of putting on more fertilizer. And I didn't put all the values in, I just couldn't fit it on the table and have it large enough. So here we're at 10 pounds, and we're at 60, 70, 80. So if we put on 60, we're going to get about this kind of yield, around 90 bushels. Put on 70 pounds, we should get around 95 bushels. And if we continue to put on nitrogen fertilizer, our yield is going up, but our increments of yield increase per bushel are going to get smaller. So then we can start putting some economics to this. If for nitrogen fertilizer is costing 65 cents a pound for nitrogen, for 10 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer, that's $6.50 for every 10 pounds of fertilizer we're putting on. What's our crop value? Well, in this case, I used $8 a bushel for hybrid spring wheat. So down here, if we put on 10 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer, it costs us $6.50, but we're going to get $64 back in terms of increased yield. But as we go across, put on more and more nitrogen fertilizer, our increments of yield increase get smaller and smaller. So this is about where I would stop. Basically, when we're at about a 2 bushel yield increase, we go from here, 130 to 140 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer is going to cost us $6.50. We're going to get a 2 bushel yield increase. That's about $16. That's about a 2-to-1 return on your money, and that's about the time to stop. But here, I've changed the price of the fertilizer from 65 to 75 cents a pound. I've dropped the wheat value from $8 to $5 a bushel. Our 2-to-1 ratio actually comes in here, the 110 to 120 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer. So same response curve, but with different economics. In one case, we'd be looking at around 140 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer. In the second case, we'd be looking maybe around 110 to 120 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer for the same crop in the same field, just different economics. This is the way I'd like to determine nitrogen fertilizer application. Now, how can you do this easily? Well, Alberta Agriculture a number of years ago developed a fertilizer program called AFIRM, and on all of the fertilizer response curves for all crops and all soil zones across Alberta were included in this program. AFIRM stands for Alberta Farm Fertilizer Information Recommendation Manager. You can download from the Alberta Agriculture website. This is the address for it. But just type in AFIRM on the Alberta Agriculture website, do a search for it, and you can find it, and then you can actually have direct access to it. We just updated a year ago by Len Krasnowski. I retired 7 years ago, then updated it with the newest nitrogen fertilizer response curves. I certainly encourage you to use that. It's free and gives very good information. You use it for not only for nitrogen, but for all the other nutrients as well. So it's a very good, useful program. Now the downside is that the Alberta government has laid off all people involved with soil fertility and fertilizer research and extension. So Len, who developed or updated the last version of this program, was terminated a little over a year ago. And the last of the people, for example, a person that replaced me in Poly, when I retired, he and all his staff were all terminated last month. So we have nobody left in Alberta to develop and continue to update these fertilizer response curves. So in the future, we're going to be having to face with developing nitrogen fertilizer rates differently. And one of the ways that some people even do it now is the crop removal method. They'll just simply recommend to a farmer to apply the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that will be removed by the target yield of a crop. And in my mind, that's a flawed way to do it. It doesn't consider the soil test nitrogen. You might have higher levels of nitrogen in the field, so you don't need to put that much. Or you might have very low nitrogen levels, and if you don't consider the total nitrogen level of a crop, not just what's going to be removed, but the total nitrogen requirements, that's not going to be good. So, and by doing this, nitrogen fertilizer rate is not based on the cost of the fertilizer or the value of the crop. So it's really a flawed method, but down the road, we may be forced to do this because of the lack of the wisdom by the Minister of Alberta Agriculture. Another way that some agronomists will determine nitrogen application is the calculation method, and this is a reasonable way to do it. With this method, you estimate the total nitrogen needed for a target yield of the crop you're working with, and then so you want to apply the amount of nitrogen based on what's the total requirement, subtract the soil nitrogen level that you've done from your soil test, and then the lab will also give you an estimated mineralization value. Subtract those two numbers, and then that's the way you apply your nitrogen fertilizer. So you do need soil test nitrogen information. You do need to have an estimate of mineralization of nitrogen, but it does not consider, by doing it this way, you don't consider the efficiency of the nitrogen that you've applied. Is it 60% or 70%? That's not taken into consideration. But these things are taken into consideration when you develop fertilizer response curves in different soil areas. That's why I like using fertilizer response curves that are developed in the field versus doing the calculation method. And then the other downside of doing this, it's not based on crop price or crop value. So that's the downside of doing the calculation method. So the next thing we'll talk about is phosphorus. And I'll just refer you before I retired, I rewrote and updated all of the fact sheets. For example, this one is phosphorus fertilizer application crop protection with the latest information we had available from all of our field research. And just as a reminder, when you're sending your soil test labs, you're sending your soil samples to a lab, make sure that in Alberta you're using the modified Kelowna method. If you're on Manitoba, for example, you'd want the sodium bicarbonate method to be used, but for Alberta, that's the recommended method. Now, all our soil test calibration work for the last 30 years in Alberta has been done with this particular method. So that's the method we're using in Alberta, the modified Kelowna method, and here's the ratings. If your soil test level is in 0 to 15 or 15 to 30, we have a very high probability of crop response to phosphorus. As your soil test levels increase, you still have moderate to moderately high probability. But once your soil test level is over 90 pounds, you have a relatively low probability of crop response. So let's just look at an actual response chart. We've got this one here is for based on the modified Kelowna method for hard red spring wheat. We have all the different soil zones across Alberta here. Let's just say you're farming near Lethbridge in the dark brown soil zone. If your soils have good moisture going into spring, and let's say, for example, your soil test range is 20 to 30 pounds, well, then we would recommend 30 pounds of phosphate applied with the seed. And that's what we would recommend, but there's always room for fine tuning. You want to read the fact sheet to see how much you want to maybe increase or decrease in that number. This is kind of your starting point. Your soils are drier than normal, you might want to cut that rate back to 25 pounds. If it's wetter than normal, you have very good soil moisture, you might want to bump that up to 35 pounds. So it gives you a bit of a range and a bit of flexibility. And if you own a land, you might want to be building your phosphorus levels. If it's rented land, you might be wanting to use maybe a bit of a lower level. But there's various other factors you want to think about when you're fine-tuning and coming up with this final actual number. Now, the other thing we have, the next chart after this, but the recommendation that we have, then we also have probabilities. And for example, in the dark brown soil zone, that's 20 to 30 pounds of the soil test level. Well, if you apply the fertilizer, we've got about an 80% chance of getting a 2 bushel yield increase, or 65% chance of getting a 5 bushel increase. So we actually give you probabilities of what your likelihood would be of getting a yield increase. It would be economic. So that's one of the other nice things about using this data, is it gives you probabilities. And so if your soil test levels are down here, you can say, well, gee, I might only have a 30 or 40% chance of getting a yield increase of 2 bushels, so maybe it's not worth it to put that fertilizer on. Just a couple of comments about phosphorus soil. Phosphorus and fertilizer phosphorus are quite immobile, and as a result, phosphorus is not very mobile. And so most of our work with phosphorus, the recommendation are really based on the seed place phosphorus up to what is safe to seed place. For example, with canola, our safe rate is about 15 pounds per acre. I don't like to go higher than that. If your recommendations for 40 pounds, we'll put 15 pounds with the seed and put the remaining 25 pounds in the side band. But I do like to put as much with the seed as safe, because it often will give you a bit of a starter or pop-up effect, especially when soils are colder and wetter. And in direct seeding conditions, farmers are seeding earlier into cooler, wetter soils, and that will give you a bit of advantage to put that phosphate with the seed. So the next one we'll talk about is potassium. It tends to be less problem with deficiency in southern Alberta in our brown and dark brown soils, but a greater risk of potassium deficiency in our thin black and gray soils in central and north central Alberta. But definitely go to this fact sheet, read it, and this is where we have our fertilizer response tables for various charts or various crops. Now, if your soil test level for potassium is less than 100, that's extremely deficient, and you're at a very high probability you're going to get a response to potassium. As your soil test levels increase, then we would change for very deficient, from moderately deficient, from largely deficient. And once you're up at about 250, that's really about our cutoff for many of our annual crops, not for all, but for most of our crops. If you're between 250 and 300, really that's adequate, but you might want to put on a maintenance application just to make sure you don't run into a deficiency. But once you're over 300, really no need for potassium for most annual crops, with the exception of high producing irrigated crops like sugar beets or potatoes or alfalfa. I thought I'd just show you this. This is just summarizing the work that we did with barley for over 40 years across Alberta. When soil test levels are less than 50 for potassium, every one of our research sites across Alberta responded to potassium. Or when soil test level was between 50 and 100, 75% of our sites responded. As you can see, as our soil test levels increase, for example, when soil test levels are between 200 and 250, only 18% of our research sites responded to potassium. Then once we're over 250, only 3% of all research sites over 40 years responded to potassium. So that's really why we use that 250 cutoff. Once you're over that, probably not really necessary, but we want to put on a maintenance application, that's fine. But I thought I'd just show you that, just to kind of put things in perspective for you. And barley is the crop that does tend to respond more so to potassium than, say, wheat or canola. So here's a replica or the chart for cereal crops for wheat and barley. If you're in the dark brown soil zone and your soil test level is between 150 and 200 pounds, we call that moderately deficient. And we'd be recommending somewhere between 20 and 45 pounds. And if you read the AgDex publication, it kind of help you decide whether you want to go to a bit of a lower rate or a higher rate. But here's where you can do a bit of fine tuning and decide what exact rate you want to really put on. It puts things into perspective for you by using these tables. And just a few comments. In southern Alberta, where would you most likely see a potassium deficiency? On irrigated sandy soils tend to be the most deficient in potassium. And if you have an intensive crop rotation, where you might have alfalfa, potatoes, or sugar beets in rotation, all these are very big potassium users. Some people are growing soybeans now. They're a heavy user of potassium as well. They're more susceptible to potassium deficiency. Really, in Alberta, though, the place I get most concerned are the black and gray soils. They tend to be potassium deficient, and a soil test will really confirm that for you. Potassium is also not very mobile, so you want to place it near the seed. If you need both phosphorus and potassium, I'd say put the phosphate with the seed and put the potassium in the side band as close to the seed as possible, but not with the seed. Simply because potassium chloride fertilizer has a fairly high salt index, and too much potassium in the seed can really negatively affect germination and emergence of crops. Anyways, we're getting close to the bitter end. We'll talk about sulfur. And again, I updated the fact sheet. So make sure you read the fact sheet. It gives you lots of good information, sulfur fertilizer application and crop production. And just a little bit of a discussion. When we do our soil sample, remember I said sample 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24 inches. Particularly in our brown and dark brown soil, it's very common. We'll have gypsum salts in that subsoil. And gypsum salts are calcium sulfates. And so that's always going to give you a higher level of sulfate in the subsoil. And that's very important. If you do break that down, you'll often find ample amounts of sulfate in that 12 to 24 inch depth. And if that's the case, it's very unlikely most of the time you're going to need sulfur fertilizer. Another thing to keep in mind, if you're an irrigation farmer in southern Alberta or in Saskatchewan, for every 12 inches of irrigation water you put on, where that water has its source in the Rocky Mountains, we're going to be putting on about 30 pounds of actual sulfate per acre. So it's very unusual to run into sulfur deficiency on irrigated land, but it does happen occasionally. And when it does, it's really when the surface soil is deficient. It's quite common to have lots of sulfur down here, but if you after a good yielding crop or a wet period where that sulfate, which is mobile, moves downward, we might find our surface soil is deficient in sulfate, but we have lots down here. If you have lots down here, you still may be deficient, still may be needing to put on some sulfur fertilizer. This is a good starter to get the crop going until the roots get down into the subsoil. So again, that's the importance of doing depth sampling and looking at your sulfur at the different depths. Now, this table is not in that fact sheet. I just kind of updated a little bit. So what I suggest is look at your sulfur depth, 0 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 24 inch depth. And if you're at over 30 pounds, for most of the crops we're growing, we don't need to use sulfur fertilizer. But if you're less than that, for example, you're in that 10 to 20 range, you are deficient. If you're growing wheat, I'd suggest put on 10 to 15 pounds of sulfur. You're growing canola, I'd suggest 15 to 20 pounds of sulfur. And that's what I'd suggest. But the other thing is, after you look at this, how much sulfur is in the 0 to 24 inch depth, the next thing you want to do is what is your sulfur level in the 0 to 6 inch depth. You might have lots total in 24 inch depth, but you might be deficient in the topsoil. And if you are, then you need to be putting in some sulfur fertilizer to get that crop off to a good start initially in the spring until the roots get down to the subsoil and tap into the sulfur in the subsoil. The last thing I'm going to talk about is micronutrients, and as a general rule, micronutrients in southern Alberta haven't been widely observed. Matter of fact, they're quite rare. When I was working with Alberta Agriculture, we did well over 200 different trials mostly on irrigated land, some on dry, mostly on irrigation land. And we felt if we couldn't get micronutrient response on irrigated land under optimum conditions, we certainly weren't going to get it on dry land. And really, the only crop of any significance that responded to micronutrients was really dry beans on sandy soils that were responding to zinc. We determined that back in the early 1990s, and I actually haven't seen zinc deficiency on beans for years, just simply because most farmers know that that could be an issue. They soil test for it and they fertilize for it. So micronutrients in that case typically aren't a huge problem in southern Alberta and central Alberta. They can be, particularly with copper. If you test for micronutrients and they're all good, then I'd suggest don't worry about micronutrients for about at least another 5 years. But when you are testing for them, we can look at boron, chloride, copper, iron, manganese, and zinc. In Alberta, the one that I'm most concerned about really is copper. As long as you're at 0.5 parts per million or less, then I'd be looking at potentially using it, especially on thin black, and gray soils. I really don't get too worried about boron and chloride. Soil tests don't always give us a good indication, but if you are less than, say, 0.4 parts per million for boron, it does raise a bit of a red flag, and you might want to be watching things carefully, maybe do some test strips for boron, but I wouldn't be too concerned, because most of the time, and most of the trials we've done across the province, when we're less than this, most of the time we don't get a response. So that's really where a lot more work needs to be done. I'm afraid there's nobody left in Alberta to really do that kind of research, sadly. And in zinc, I look at about 0.5. One soil test report I showed you from Eastern Canada, they said if you're less than 2 parts per million, they're worried. But really for Alberta, for most crops, I don't worry about zinc until it's less than 0.5. So there you have it. But basically what I would suggest is if you test for micronutrients and they come out deficient, or you have an agronomist who's making micronutrient recommendations for you, what I'd suggest is seek opinions from several unbiased experts, preferably from an independent agronomist who's not selling fertilizer. Get a couple of opinions and before you go ahead and use micronutrients. And if you are still unsure, I strongly recommend doing a few test strips to test on farm for yourself to see if you're really going to get a response or not. Now, when I've referred to a few different publications, there's lots of publications we've written over the years. These are just some of the ones that I've written. They're on the website, so if you're growing mustard or Timothy for hay under irrigation or dryland, or many other crops we've written AgDex reports for, or AgDex fact sheets for. Look on the Alberta Agriculture website, see what you can find to explore and find more information to help you out. Now, just to summarize, what I always suggest to farmers is very carefully review each soil test report. Are there any physical or chemical concerns? Are there things like pH or a high sodium or soil salinity, high soluble salt levels that are a concern? If you do, that's a red flag, and that's going to really affect your yield potential and the fertilizer recommendations you're going to be developing. And you really want to be exploring what can I do to maybe improve those soils. So then I'd suggest you consult with a soil specialist. And Alberta Agriculture no longer has any soil specialists, so you'll have to look to agronomists who have a good expertise in soils and see what kind of advice they might actually have for you. So that's what I'd suggest if there's specific soil concerns that you actually have. And then in terms of soil nutrients, you want to identify which ones are low or deficient or marginal. And then what fertilizer would you use to correct each of those deficiencies, whether it's nitrogen or phosphorus or sulfur? What fertilizer products would be best to use, what rate, what method of application, what time of application. So that's really the next step, beyond soil test interpretation, is the 4R method of developing fertilizer recommendations for best efficiency. And as I said before, and I'll repeat it one more time, work with a good agronomist, independent agronomist, and your fertilizer dealer, and get suggestions from both. And if there's differences of opinion, seek other opinions before you make your final decision. There's always room for improvement, and there's always room to do some fine-tuning after you talk to other specialists. So that's about it that I've got. I've kind of pretty much used up my 45 minutes. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you actually have. And I will say that after I retired 7 years ago, I did do contract work, and I'm getting such an old crotchety bastard now that I don't even do that anymore. I'm pretty much fully retired. I want to spend my time on the ski hills in the winter. But if you ever have a burning question and you would like another unbiased opinion, I'm giving you my home phone number, 328-1001 in Lethbridge. I do have a Twitter account, so you can direct message me. And I've also given you my email address, McKenzie, all one word, @shaw.ca. And so if you do have concerns, you'd like my opinion. Now, first of all, I have to point out, it's a money-back guarantee. I won't charge you for my advice. I'm more than happy to give you my thoughts and opinions. But maybe just email the reports you're concerned about and what your concerns are. I'd be happy to have a look at, and give me a phone number, and I will give you a call back, and I'd be happy to have a chat with you. And I'm more than happy to do that. Just out of the, just for my personal standpoint, I'm always happy to give my honest opinion to farmers. So that's it for me, and I'll leave it open now to questions, and I'll turn it back to Brad.